just AI alone, left alone on its own to develop at its own pace, we're probably going to be faced with some form of non-human intelligence that is smarter than us definitely within the next decade. How does UFO tech fit into this larger dynamic for you?
It's a fantastic question. I have studied international politics longer than I've studied UFOs. I've been doing UFOs for about 30 years, a little more than that, actually. And I've studied politics since I was in my mid-teens, so almost half a century. And it's kind of my first love in terms of history, and I've never left it. So yes, I will. And for UFOs, I study the politics of the cover-up. I mean, I think people who are familiar with me realize that I'm somewhat political in my analysis of the UFO phenomenon to begin with. So it's a fair question. And short answer is, I mean, I'm still trying to work out how do we fit the entire UFO phenomenon into the changing nature of geopolitics. But there are long answers, and I can talk a little bit about this. So I have believed, as we heard from someone like David Grush a couple of years ago, that there has been a covert Cold War arms race going on with UFO tech. I think that is true. We absolutely know for sure. I mean, the U.S. has acquired these objects, so have the Russians, and I'm pretty sure to some extent, so have the Chinese. I'm in the process right now. I'm doing a little side road on my website. I'm supposed to be finishing volume 2 of my USO study, but I'm doing a side road into the history of Chinese ufology right now. And I'll probably make a presentation for them in the next day or two. And that's quite fascinating. And I'll be doing the same with Russian ufology. I want to do this because it's important to understand what are the real directions of these organizations and what is their relationship to their governments, their respective governments. In the case of China, it's very obvious. The Chinese government dominates UFO groups in that country. They fund them, but they also monitor them very carefully. And ever since 1999, when they cracked down on the Falun Gong, they have been adamant about what type of ufology is to be practiced in China. It's very, very controlled, and not a lot of information comes out of there. That's the other thing.
What do you mean when you say what type of ufology practice there?
Oh, well, yeah. So in China, the communist government there is very materialistic. They don't do spirituality, right?
Right.
So they don't believe in that. But China itself has a whole history of things like Qigong. They have their own history of spiritual practices. And so you can see that in China, there is undoubtedly a hunger among a portion of the population for some kind of spirituality. When Mao died in 1976, during the Mao period, UFO research was absolutely forbidden. It was not allowed. But there was an opening in the late 70s and the early 80s for this. And you see this split. You get it in the West, too, between a kind of scientific, nuts and bolts approach to the problem and contactees, spiritual messages from the Space Brothers and this type of thing. That is very big in China. But it became repressed after 1999 because one of the groups that became hugely influential in China was called the Falun Gong, and they're still around. I think they got something like 70 million followers by 1999. That's a lot of people, even in China. And they were well organized, and the Chinese government clearly felt threatened by them and banned them. They called them an evil cult and imprisoned. Allegations of torture and even organ harvesting have been alleged. Could be true. Wow. I don't know. They went after these people. And so ever since in Chinese ufology, you got to be very careful if you're going to start talking about spirituality or Qigong or meditation practices and in connection with UFOs. That is not going to get you anything but trouble over that.
How do the Russians see this differently than we do, or the Chinese, for example?
The Russians, did you just say?
Yeah. And in your research and your work, what do you make of the way the Russians look at all of this?
I think there's some very, very fine Russian ufologists. For my USO study, I was able to commandeer a copy of a Russian book on USOs. They did one. One of the authors recently passed away, but it's a very fine book. And you can tell that this has been an active area. Now, in the old Soviet Union days, UFO research was also not quite banned to the extent that it was under Mao Zedong, but it was, for a long time, it was not something that was publicly acknowledged or published. And the Soviet government, just like the US government, had a very strong skeptical take on it. And that was just the official take that was allowed. But there were government-sanctioned UFO studies that took place in the 1960s and 70s. There was some level of private research that was sort of tolerated in the 70s and 80s. And once you get to Gorbachev in the mid-80s, the Soviet information space really did open up a lot. And one of the things that opened up were UFO stories. And at the end of the Soviet Union, a lot of KGB records came out, and we discovered, oh yes, they have had more than their share of encounters, military, civilian, the whole thing. So the Soviets and now the Russians, they have a very active UFO community, but unfortunately, there's more that we've learned about them than we've learned about the Chinese researchers. But unfortunately, there really just is not enough communication between Western UFO research and the Russians and the Chinese. And I really do hope that we can correct that because we need to understand what those researchers are coming up with in those regions. They're both massively important.
I've got an audience question here from a friend of the show, Dr. Dan. He wants to know, what are your thoughts on the cultural differences between the way Europe and the United States see or perceive UFOs and NHI?
Europe has never been as friendly ideologically and culturally to the UFO phenomenon as Americans have been. And that includes the British as well. I think they're part of that. There's a much, I've been over there a number of times and a lot of friends over there. And I've always believed that they're, certainly they don't have the kind of as much of a grassroots engagement with the subject that you are likely to find in North America, US, and we'll include Canada. But there are very good organizations in Europe nonetheless. That's in the UK, in Italy. I was recently chatting with Marco Bianchini of one of the Italian groups there, and the Italians have always had a very active UFO research community. They do great. France has very active people there. Even in Germany, which doesn't have as much happening there. And Germany is a real black hole in a sense, but there still are some decent German researchers out there too. And the Scandinavian countries they've got something. So it's not like this is absent, but I think they're facing a little bit more of an uphill battle in terms of getting the message out to the public. I think that's—
You're talking about in terms of civilian groups that are looking at the UFO situation, but in terms of the military intelligence apparatus, it would fall under NATO, I imagine.
Yeah, and in that regard, look, the EU is in a bad way. NATO is in a terrible way. You can see it, and I don't think this is outrageous to say that both of those institutions have utterly ossified into essentially a kind of post-Cold War, modern neo-Stalinist Soviet structure. That's what they are. So they don't really respond to the people at all, really, not in any way they don't. And so, you're not going to get a lot of public responsiveness from either the NATO headquarters or Brussels and the EU.
Do you get the sense that as artificial intelligence continues to advance at the pace that it's advancing, if we really do have the breakthroughs that are being promised by Silicon Valley and what we're seeing from China, it seems like we could rapidly gain some much needed ground on UFO research in terms of the technology, reverse engineering it, understanding it, applying it possibly. If you had to project out over the next 25, 30 years, I'm going to ask you a really weird, broad question, but hopefully you can make something of this. What is the role of the nation state going forward in a world where you have unlimited intelligence and potentially clean energy sources from some reverse engineered UFO tech? Does this dynamic, does one influence the other, and how do they affect one another over the next decades?
There's a lot packed into that question. I want to answer one thing first, which I thought you were going to ask, which is where will AI go in terms of UFO research and how will it help?
Yes.
And I just want to say, I think that there are tremendous possibilities here. Right now, with AI, we're all focused on large language models, LLMs, but there are other aspects of AI that can be incredibly useful from a UFO research point of view. That means data analysis, number crunching, and the like. And I think we're only at the very beginning of that. You hear about something like the Galileo project, Avi Loeb's endeavor, where they've got telescopes out and they're tracking known versus unknown aerial objects, and they're using, it's all AI, it's all algorithms to sift out. So I think there's a lot of possibilities in all areas, both document research and data collection and all of that. And I think AI can be very helpful. There's a lot of dangers to AI. We can get into that. Absolutely, many dangers. In terms of your question about the nation state, now that came out of left field for me. That's an interesting question. We are looking at, look, the nation state already, we're near 2025 here. It ain't what it used to be in the 20th century. Let's just put that right out there. You remember when COVID was in full force and we were being forced to take vaccines or being locked down and all of this stuff. And what you could see was that every nation in the Western Alliance was working in lockstep, using the exact same talking points, the exact same propaganda points, build back better and all this nonsense, and really to bludgeon the public into submission. I think there can be no question about this anymore. It was a heavy-handed, beat the head of the public over and over with the big stick. And what that tells us is that these national leaders were not acting independently. They were part of a collective, probably World Economic Forum, maybe the Bilderberg people. And that is the reality. So the nation state has been in a bad way for a long time. You mentioned it yourself. Global financial institutions have vastly more power than most nation states. Okay, there's a few outliers, US, China, Russia. But most nations are not big enough, maybe India now, but most of them are not big enough to really withstand the power of most multinational corporations or financial institutions that want to, break into your country and siphon all your mineral wealth out or whatever. They can't resist. The African nations, they've struggled with this for generations, for example.
Well, we're seeing it in Ukraine with minerals in Ukraine. There's a big battle over who's going to get their hands on that, right?
Yeah, It's funny. Trump brings up the expression, "You have no cards." Well, it's true Zelensky has no cards, but neither does Trump. The Russians have the cards there. The mineral wealth that they're talking about in Ukraine is 90% of it is under Russian feet right now, the Russian army. They're not going to get that. That's not happening. If Trump really wants to make a deal about the minerals, he'll probably just deal directly with Putin. The Russians have 20 times the amount of mineral wealth anyway that the Ukrainians have, so why wouldn't he? But it's all like the nation state is on an absolute long-term decline. I don't think there's any way around this. We're seeing a kind of reaction against globalization happening now. Whether you like or don't like Trump, that's what this election really signified, kind of an anti-globalist movement. And you see it in other parts of the world. And it's not difficult to see that Russia, again, like them or not, are not on board with the path of Western globalization. And maybe not the Chinese either. But in the long run, my belief is that we're going to move toward a kind of centralized global system. I mean, you're either looking at Huxley or Orwell. Huxley saw the whole thing as one global state. Okay. Orwell saw it as like three.
Right.
Pick your pick. Pick your poison. I don't know how it will break down. Right now, it looks like we're moving toward Orwell. But Huxley may win in the long run if you give it another 50 years, 100 years. And I say this because we're looking at an ever greater digital integration of the world. This is inevitable. This is not a political thing. This is not like Trump's doing this or Biden did that. It's irrelevant. We're moving toward a world that is becoming inexorably more digitally controlled and therefore centralized. It's almost like they almost can't even help themselves. It's like, look, you and I are talking like across many miles. with great digital connection. We figured out the echo that I was getting. So it's kind of amazing. It's like magical. To make that happen, though, requires a very integrated global digital structure that's going to require rules that are systematic for everyone. In other words, we're moving toward a world that's, like it or not, is more and more centralized and less wiggle room for freedom, unfortunately. Now, I'm on the side of the forces that want to slow that down and put a brake on it for as long as possible. But I don't know if that's going to be possible to stop forever.